I thank you and your church for the invitation to come and share with you tonight. It's brave souls that come out on a Friday evening. At my church, we always nervous if we schedule anything on Friday evening because it may be sort of vacant. But I'm welcome you here. What I have to share with you tonight, first I want to simply introduce myself. I'm a retired family physician, having worked in a little town called Forest Grove, Oregon for a 40-year period, and I retired 20 years past. In those 20 years since, I've been very active in many parts of the world, sharing with many of our church members and many non-church members the health message, and also this unique message of exposing spiritualistic practices that have crept into our medical world. Going back 1971, President Nixon went to China. And when he returned, we found in the newspapers more about what had happened to one of the reporters over there in China. He had gotten appendicitis and had a surgical procedure done, and they used acupuncture for the anesthesia. Can you remember that? 1971, this was all across the United States. And that initiated patients requesting of physicians, what about this? What do you know about it? I had never heard of such before. Even through medical school, never heard the expression. And so that initiated in my mind questions as much as the patients that asked me, the people that asked me my concept. I said, I don't know any more about it than you do. And through the years then, as physicians visited one with another, I didn't find anybody that knew anything more than I did, which was nothing. And that initiated a beginning to examine, to understand this. I had a feeling about it, and I chose not to involve myself, nor would I recommend patients to take some of these therapies, because I just had a feeling that it wasn't something that I would choose. And after 20 years of in that back and forth, I finally found a little booklet that gave me the answer, gave me a key so that I could find the answer. And that key that was in that book I'll share with you tomorrow morning. But tonight I bring to you something a little different than those occultic activities or those alternative therapies, but this is a component part of the program. What we're going to look at tonight is the story of our health message. Why that? The whole program, my objective is to help you understand and see how some of these therapies that are becoming popular and common are moving in and have a greater purpose than just attempting to heal somebody. They are a method by which to bring deception and pull people into a new worldview, the Eastern worldview. It's a component part of the end-time movement, I believe, that has its purpose to eventually have, the Bible tells us that the large group, the whole world over here, and here's a small group that keep the commandments and have the faith and testimony of Jesus. It is a component part of moving the whole world into spiritualism, because the Spirit prophecy tells us in the book Great Controversy, at the end time the whole world, except for those that are deep into the scriptures, will be deceived and involved in spiritualism. Now, oftentimes you think about spiritualism as sitting around a table with the lights dim and the cobwebs and the table raising or a seance. We're talking about different philosophies that are involved in spiritualism, and we'll cover that tomorrow. But first, we need to look at what God has given us as a people. starting in 1848. Here, a health message has been handed to the church. And now 150 or so years later, the world recognizes it as a leading method of health, the best health advice out there. 150 years at time, much of that, at least 100 of those years, the science was decrying, saying you're wrong. When I started practice in 1960, there wasn't anything that we had in science that backed up our beliefs and our practices of lifestyle and our dietary. And I ran into lots of flack about that. By the time I had finished my practice, now people were coming to see me because they had heard now that that's a better way, that the church had something to offer. What a change. And almost everything now that we have believed in has been shown to be superior. And so what we do tonight, we go through the history of how this came about and its purpose and its effect to show that God has given to a people something to share with the world. But more than that is to help prepare a people mentally, so their minds work right, to accept what has given to us on the cross. Salvation. The purpose is for us to have a clear mind and be able to understand what was given to us on the sacrifice at the cross. Gift of salvation. That's the ultimate purpose. And when we have that, then now comes sweeping through the world and through the Western world and into our church, unfortunately, a system that is the devil's right arm to his message. We have a right arm. It's a part of the third angel's message, unequivocally. But the devil has his, and it has been extremely effective for him. Let's proceed. And we'll get more into that part tomorrow. Way back in the earliest days, 2,000 years plus BC, some of the records found of the Mesopotamian Valley and in Egypt show that there was a reasonable understanding of disease, its cause and effect. What was behind to allow these changes in the body's system? It had a reasonable answer. But giving 1,500 years later, it was all irrational. As the loss of the knowledge of God, the blessings of knowledge of health were removed. And now it became, in the days of the Exodus, all mystical. The writings that we have of the papyrus writings have detailed description of the Egyptian approach to health and healing. And it was mystical. It didn't make, to you and I, common sense from cause to effect. Their understanding as to what caused disease was the problem. And it was looked at as a mystical, something more of spirit nature. Then the Israelites were taken across the desert in the Exodus. And God gave principles for their camp of health and hygiene. He gave principles of prevention. Nowhere in the Bible do you find therapies given advice, God giving advice as to how to deal with diseases. Maybe one place where to put a fig poultice on a boil. But at large, it was prevention. And in the history books of medicine, they will go from civilization to civilization, showing the advances, the things that each civilization added to the knowledge down through time. And they come to the Jewish civilization, and there was no special advancement in the knowledge of therapy, but it was all prevention. I've read two texts of history of medicine. Both of them presented this, that the Jewish nation was known for its prevention. How much more intelligent than waiting for a disease and trying to treat it. And this is what God has given us. But that same prevention can be used for therapy so often. But the Egyptian practices that they had at the days that the Israelites went across the desert have not stood the test of time, where what God gave the knowledge to Israel are the standards of our health, of our public health today. The very principles of our public health God gave to the Israelites as they went across the desert. Some simple things, but it had to do with an understanding of what caused disease. He helped direct them to avoid doing certain things in their lifestyle and so forth, and this was a prevention. So where God's knowledge is, where He blesses us with His knowledge, He also blesses us with a knowledge of health and healing. And what we see today, we have the zenith in the knowledge of science that the world has ever had relevant to medicine. But at the same time, here comes from the East, sweeping through the West, practices that have been used for millennia in those civilizations without evidence of one day's extra life as a benefit from it. No evidence whatsoever, but coming in even into our church as if this is an answer to prayer. It is not. And you remember when the people were coming across the desert, they came to a place where there was some ponds of water, there was water, and they were thirsty. They had had all they could take without the water. And then the water was bitter. Remember that? And God told Moses, throw some bushes into the ponds, and they became sweet. And this verse was given at that time. And God is speaking, He said, if you will diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in His sight, give ear to His commandments and keep all His statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. There you would think that maybe what we choose to do and how we live does have a part to play as to what we're going to face in our own body as proper functioning or illness. And in Deuteronomy 8:4 he says, we're told here that Moses is speaking to the people, your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell those 40 years. And David made the comment that there was no feeble ones among them. God blessed them. Now, of course, they did die, but as they were functioning, they evidently had some health. Now, in the early days of the Christian organization, the Christian church, the first couple centuries, we have records showing that there were a number of physicians that were rather advanced in their knowledge. There was a relationship in their understanding between disease and health and to what was the cause of it. So those records are on there. But then there became a change of the knowledge of people. What happened? Well, there began a time in the 3rd, 4th centuries thereabouts where they said the soul is separated from the body. And so the body is not worth much. And there was lack of interest in the body thereafter. And the dealing with disease was done by exorcism. Gradually, through the centuries, the sick people would come to the church or to the cathedrals, and they would do exorcism for their illness because it was caused by spirits in their understanding. This was the concept. In fact, it grew as the darkness of God's knowledge of salvation grew so dark in those ages, in the Middle Ages, grew so dark, also the health practices grew dark. As the darkness of spiritual darkness occurs, so also the practices of health and healing. So much so that actually in the 1100s, the church banned any medical therapies. Surgeries of any type or medical care was banned in Western Europe by the pain of death. What happened to the physicians? Many of them went to Arabia. They went to Damascus to practice, where the knowledge of medicine was kept alive. But in Western Europe, it went, midnight of the world is the expression. You've heard that before, and that's exactly what it was. And during those dark ages, medicine went down. It was irrational. And they began to explain everything as spirits. Rather than a lifestyle of choice of habits of living, they dealt with it by exorcism. But then during the Renaissance, we began to see a bit of a change, a just beginning of a ray of light to come through, and approaching the field of medicine. Bit by bit, a little fact of science would come out and begin to start a very slow process towards some improvement. And by the mid-19th century, at this time when our church began, the 1800s, early 1800s or mid-1800s, at that time the medical science and science itself was not very strong. There was really no comprehension of chemistry or physics or physiology. And the scientific investigation as to learn how things functioned in the body hadn't really started yet. But it was here and there was an individual that was bright and beginning to try to penetrate the darkness. But at the practitioner out in the field, it was bad, very bad. But there was hope for the future. How did they deal with somebody with a fever? Well, they'd put them in a dark room, no water, no fluid, and have it very hot. Just the opposite of what we would do. We would give water, we would let the light in, and we would let the temperature be appropriate. They used a lot of heavy metals, mercury, arsenic, antimony, and nicotine, strychnine, opium, digitalis, and others. They had many herbs, hundreds of herbs they used, but also there were the use of these concepts of these heavy metals. There was not an understanding among the physicians in this country or Western Europe, around the world, as the source of what causing disease. The problem was a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of what caused disease. And it wasn't until there was a better understanding of what caused it, then the therapies could change and there was improvement. But medicine at large in this country and elsewhere during the early 1800s, mid-18, clear up to the early 1900, very bad. They did not know about germs. It wasn't until the 1860s that bacteria were discovered. The concept of cleanliness was not understood, that the filth and disease helped contribute and spread different diseases. The control of body waste was not appropriately dealt with. Nutrition was not understood. And even the preservation of some of the foods and the pickling and the smoking and so forth were a source of some disorders. The way of heating and burning at a very high temperature, some of the meat preparations also producing many carcinogens on them. Common use of tobacco and alcohol, coffee and tea were commonly used. Working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. You see the whole style. And living like in the cities of Boston or in London where your houses are up, you seldom saw the daylight because no place for the children to play. Rickets was rampant. And all of these different disorders because of the lifestyle. And one of the things the rich had to deal with, in the early days, the white flour was expensive and only the rich could afford it. And so having white bread was a luxury, became a status symbol. Everybody wanted it. Did not understand that in the refining of the flour, you were removing most of the nutrients, the minerals as well as vitamins and the phytochemicals there. And so this was a problem. And where wintertime came and the people that eventually the poor people began to use the white flour because it was able to be produced cheaply later on, that became a problem of its own. So medical treatment at that time was basically worthless, many times harmful and even deadly. Bleeding. Why did they bleed people? Because they didn't have an concept of what caused disease. They felt it was a balancing of fluids in the body that wasn't balanced right, so they drained the blood off. So the concept of what caused disease was a primary thing, and that we'll deal with when we get into those practices that we want to expose tomorrow. There's the concept of what causes disease is not what you and I understand today is the source of disease. Spirit prophecy tells us disease is the end result of the body's response to not following the health rules. water, exercise, fresh air, those different things that you're well aware of. Medical treatment was poor, and so alternative approaches came along. There was a lot of physicians and others looking on and says, hey, things don't go well when you go to the medical profession. It's not always so good. And so that made wide open for alternative therapies. Now what many of these alternative therapies did is they didn't do the bad things like those heavy metals we're talking about, and didn't draw blood, and they did some simple approach, and they did better than the general medical care. But guess what? Whatever they did, maybe they had some concoction they used or applied, got the credit rather than just not doing all of those bad things. And so many alternatives spread and became popular because they did get along better, but what they were doing wasn't a benefit other than not doing those bad things. Did you follow me on that? Let's go to one back in 1777. A doctor on a ship had a ship that typhus was running rampant, and he was losing his sailors fast. Those that were extremely sick, they would put them down in the hold of the ship where it was hot. It was wet, damp, dark, and foul air. That was the therapy. And he got so many sick that they filled up the bottom hole. There wasn't room for them, so they took those that looked like they were dying and brought them up and put them on deck. And then the new ones that got sick put put them in their place below. And the ones up on decks begging for water to put over them because they were so hot and so miserable. The ship doctor says, well, they're going to die anyhow, so if it helps them feel better, we'll do that. So they began to splash them with water and let them have water. And most of those survived. So the ship doctor, he applied this again at other times with success. Another ship or two, ship doctor picked it up. But basically it was lost. And they would not be accepted because it didn't fit the thinking of the day or the rest of the ship doctors around the world. You know, even scurvy, vitamin C was solved 100 years before actually it really was picked up and recognized. But because it didn't fit into the thinking, it was ignored on that. And this then started the interest of water therapy. Vincent Pritznetz, a young boy of 13 years of age in 1812, sprained his wrist. He lived in Austria, and he went out and pumped water from the cold well water on his wrist. It felt better, reduced some of the pain and misery that he had, and he started playing with water and developed over time, as he became an adult, a practice in water therapy. Became so famous that doctors from around the world came to his place in Austria. But the local physicians tried to put him out of business. They just couldn't accept this. It didn't fit into the cause of disease. But it became prominent, and there were water cure places, many places, and was reasonable, and that was the beginning of hydrotherapy. In 1833, Sylvester Graham. Ever hear of graham crackers? Graham bread? You don't hear the word graham bread much anymore. We used to hear it a lot. But graham crackers, Sylvester Graham was a minister. And I think God gave him the health message that he gave this church. He was in the Oberlin College, the college where Billy Graham graduated from. But they had a vegetarian lifestyle originally there. Everything was as we would understand the knowledge of nutrition. I'm sure God gave that to him. But somehow it was lost out, and it didn't continue. Evidently not accepted or something by well. But early on, God was bringing some message to people. About 1850, it began to be a movement to have in the schools of the land teaching a little bit about health. Now, we come to 1844, where there was a great disappointment. We're all very acquainted with that period of time. Following that, for 11 years, there was a small group that continued to study the Bible to try to understand what they had been confused on at that particular time. And as they continued their studying, God, through one of those members, passed on some information. The first information to this group of believers was advising them to stop all tobacco, coffee, and tea. Now, usage of those, the ill effects will be years and years later that it comes about. So why was God concerned right then with this young people that we're studying? Its effect on the mind. It gives immediate effect on the mind. Tobacco, coffee, and tea alters the thinking. And so God, with this group that was doing their best to understand these scriptures, was trying to help them have clearer minds to work with. It took 15 years before tobacco was out of use among the believers at that time. 15 years. God was very patient. It takes some of us longer than others to catch on. Now, during that time that tobacco was being worked on to get out of the group of believers, some of the individuals in the church, or there wasn't a church yet, but of the group that was studying, read the Bible and learned that God advised to not use pork products or the pig. And they began to teach it and share it with others. And God sent a message through Ellen White saying, leave it alone. Don't teach that. God will bring it in at the proper time. Certain things this growing group could tolerate too much would perhaps cause a disintegration. The wisdom that God had that we didn't understand. But that was an interesting thing. The information I'm sharing with you, you can find in the book, The Story of Our Health Message by D.E. Robinson. It's in the Book and Bible House. He was a secretary to Ellen White for 15 years. The last 15 years of her life, he was her personal secretary. When I started medical school, he was teaching a class at Loma in the religion department, the history, that which I'm giving you, and I took a class with him teaching us about these things. And the story that I'm telling you, most of this coming from that book. The second health vision was 6 years later in 1854. And what was that about? First one, tobacco, coffee, and tea. What's this one about? I'll just find out. Cleanliness of body, cleanliness of home, cleanliness of surroundings. Very important. And you would think more about it if you really realized how people lived in that period of time. They didn't have that shower you can hop into every morning. Once a month. How many can remember taking your baths in an old tub, wash tub? And the first one got the clean water, didn't they? The last one got what's left. Yeah, I grew up, went through some of that. The water was with the pump, hand pump, and so forth. And so you didn't take a bath every day. And some of them, there was long periods in between. And the clothing, and to wash the clothing, I remember on Monday morning was wash day. Grandpa would go out and he'd start that one-cylinder engine to pump water out of the well to fill the tubs. And then they would heat it on the wood stove. And all day Monday would be wash day with the old scrub board. And then it would be dried, and then there was all of those ironings done. The iron was heated on the stove, and you pick it up. There was parts of Oregon that was late in getting electricity and a few other things, and that's where my grandparents lived on there. But then the second thing of this was to avoid grease in their diet. What's grease? Well, we think of it as the car, the lube, machinery. But grease was lard primarily. It could be beef lard or pork lard, but basically it would be the lard. Well, we go along with that now, but here's way back in 1858 saying, leave that grease alone. And don't overeat was also involved there. And then to use coarse grains instead of the fine grains. Now, that's a little hard to be certain of its meaning, but I believe we're looking at the refining, the whole grain versus the refined white. At that time, to get the white, you ground the grain, and then you sifted it through different levels of silk screens to get finally the bottom one that would come through at the bottom would be just pure white. Most of your nutrients were in above layers taken out. And this is advice not to do it. Remember, we said that there's a lot of religion in a good loaf of bread. Why? The vitamin B's were taken out. And without vitamin B's, the brain doesn't work well. Doesn't work well at all. In the early days when they were studying the vitamins, they just finding about vitamin B's, they would take a group of people, put them in one dormitory and another group here. The normal group was a control group where they gave them the regular dietary variety of foods. And those over here, they purposely made sure they didn't have food that had vitamin B in it. And they couldn't continue it too long because they fought so much with each other. It affects the brain on there. And so God is giving things here early on that weren't understood, but it was to prepare them to be able to comprehend that which they were growing in, the knowledge of salvation that God was presenting to them. I saw that God was purifying unto himself a peculiar people in whom he can delight. He will have a clean and holy people. I saw that God would not acknowledge an untidy, unclean person as a Christian. Now I want you to remember the reason we're going through this. I'm wanting to contrast what we have been given these 150 years and the end results that the world is looking and saying, how did you know this? Versus a other system, the devil's right arm, his healing system that's coming through and penetrating even into our churches. I've been asked to come and contribute into health fairs, Adventist health fairs, because I do a lot in the field of nutrition and so forth as well. And I get there and I find here's people with practices in this health fair that I wouldn't have there. I was in a camp meeting, doing a seminar at a camp meeting in Canada here a couple of years ago, and one evening a minister was sharing with the audience what he was doing for evangelistic outreach, and it was some of the practices that I expose. But we have been given a system that we can count on as valuable. It fits with science, and it has a track record that's enviable. And so I'm wanting you for us to get this comprehension, the feeling of what God gave us versus that which is tempting us and has no record of being of value, true scientific record of value. But it's sweeping through the church. Our souls, bodies, spirits are to be presented blameless by Jesus to his Father, and unless we are clean in person and pure, cannot be presented blameless to the Father. The church organized in 1863. 3,500 members at that time with 21 delegates. 2 weeks later in worship in this house, Ellen White and some others, while in worship, she was given a third vision on health. Now later she was given many more. But early on, 1844, 1848, and then 1854. Then 1863, the third. And the thing that is so important about that third vision that has to do here was that this message of 1863 emphasized that our lifestyle affected our eternal destiny. That's a very holy message. That the life eternal could depend upon our accepting. Not that we earn our way there by following, but our mind may work well enough to accept what God has offered and realize what he has done for us as we have better health, and especially brain health. Today, medical science is deeply interested in the functioning of the brain. That's the rage. For years it was heart attacks. Now it's the brain. And I received recently a book from Tufts University School of Nutrition in Boston. And you'd think it was the Adventist Health Message, except for a couple little things. And it was on nutrition in the brain, advocating exactly what we do: fruits, vegetables, grains, whole grains, they're saying now. For years they laughed at that. But now whole grains, nuts, just what we have. Now they do say alcohol is good. They're wrong there. And there's a new study out that really puts that to rest. But that's popular among medical science today, is a little alcohol for the heart. You probably have heard that. Okay, I was shown again that our health reform is one branch of the great work, which is to fit a people for the coming of the Lord. It is as closely connected with the third angel's message. Remember what that is? You can't buy or sell. You either, who do you serve? This God, or do you serve the counterfeit? It is as closely connected with the third angel's message as the hand is with the body. He, God, designs that the great subject of health reform shall be agitated and the public mind deeply stirred to investigate. For it is impossible for men and women, with all their sinful, health-destroying, brain-enerving, remember we were talking about the brain-enerving habits, to discern sacred truth, through which they are to be sanctified, refined, and made fit for the society of heavenly angels in the kingdom of glory. So now we've had these messages come in. At 1863, she was advised, and a little later, more information there should be a health institution, a place where the sick of the people of the church could go to gain health. They had young people in the church at the day. Most of them were very young, but oftentimes they couldn't meet because of so much illness. In those early years in Boston, around the year 1800, 3/4 of the deaths were from tuberculosis. And lots of those were young people. And through time, that changed. And we don't have time to get in that today on there, but it was changing the environment that made the change to where it's very rare now. Then in 1866, there was a health journal started to begin to publish this, put it out to the churches. This was slow movement to get a change of the people's lifestyle. You know how hard it is for yourself, even when you choose to make a change, to really put it into your practice steady. You work at it and then you forget it. But they had a whole group of people that they were working with. Now here's the first health institution, Western Health Reform Institute. What was the therapy? When they came here for health, and these were the church members coming. That's an actual picture of it. What was the therapy? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit here, but let's look at this comment first. The way in which Christ worked was to preach the word and to relieve suffering by the miraculous works of healing. But I am instructed that we cannot now work in this way, for Satan will exercise his power by working miracles. God's servants today could not work by miracles because spurious works of healing, claiming to be divine, will be wrought. And we'll be dealing tomorrow with some of that. For this reason, the Lord has marked out a way in which his people are to carry forward a work of physical healing, combined with the teaching of the word. How? Sanitariums are to be established. Why? Because then God will be given the credit rather than the man that might have done the healing. This is the temptation. If a person became his works, suddenly can do them in. And then it can be matched with devil's counterfeit. So the sanitariums were the way to go. And early on we had sanitariums all across this country. Here in the Northwest we had a lot of them early years. It was easy to start them. They didn't have all of the legal things to deal with that you do today. Angels will attend the patient. So if you do it God's way and set it up and have the people there that are in tune with God, angels will attend patients, helpers, and the physicians to assist in the work of restoration, so that in the end, the glory will be given to God and not to feeble, short-sighted men. Very important. Health Institute as an educational, physicians were to have the highest training possible. Dr. Kellogg was sent to Bellevue in New York for special training, and the whites helped finance his training. And so they had a physician that had very high training for the day. And they had other physicians, and they continued to do so. There were to be no novices to be connected with the health reform work. Success came by following God's directions. Progress. Now we want to move forward here. The publication of the Health Journal and then the Western Health Reform Institute was started in 1866. What was the therapy? Exercise, water treatments, a vegetarian diet, whole grains, nuts. No alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or tea. Very simple. This is sort of like prevention, but being a therapy. When the disease and disorders were caused because of their lifestyle, their dietary and other habits, then when you correct those, if there's enough left of the body's constitution, they will correct much of that by itself. And this is why this was simple, so simple that the general medical world couldn't accept it. Now, these hospitals, they did surgery, there was other things, but primarily this was the therapy. At the very beginning, that was the only therapy. Later, as the hospital advanced, there was a lot of surgery done that had its proper place. So we started the beginning of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1866. By 1878, 10 years later, 12 years later, they opened a school of health. Students would come from different churches, spend 3 months at the hospital learning the health message, going back to their individual churches to share it. They were given 3 months credit toward a medical training if they were to go to a medical school for having taken this course. So at that time it was a very valuable course in public health. That was our first school of public health. 1883, they needed Christian nurses, hard to find, and so they had to begin a nursing school. In 1895, a medical school was started called the American Medical College. And this existed till 1910. And as the graduates finished from that school, they would go out in various parts of the United States and in the world and establish their own sanitariums and nursing schools. We had them all over. I was way back in the interior of Russia, and I was presenting this very message to a church. And afterwards, the families all gathered around me. How can our students go to those nursing schools? How can we get them there? We don't have any in this country. This so impressed them. That was the plea. Find us the place that we can go. I didn't have the immediate answer for them on there as to where, but in time I think others brought to them some answers for that. John Harvey Kellogg was the doctor, so we have him here in his younger days and in his older days. My dear brother, as I have written to you, I know that the Lord has placed you in a very responsible position, standing as you do as the greatest physician in the world. That would be something to hear in your ears, wouldn't it? Coming from God. A man to whom the Lord has given understanding and knowledge. Where did he get it? The Lord blessed him. That you may do justice and reveal the true missionary spirit in the institution, which is to represent truth in contrast to error. Tonight I'm wanting to present the story of truth in health and healing. Tomorrow we want to expose the error that is creeping in, not based in physical science. As you look to God in your critical operations, the angels of God were standing by your side, and their hands were seen as your hands, performing the work with an accuracy that made the beholders surprised. Who has been by your side as you have performed these critical operations? Who has kept you calm and self-possessed in the crisis, giving you quick and sharp discernment, clear eyesight, steady nerves, and skillful precision? The Lord Jesus has sent his angel to your side to tell you what to do. A hand has been laid upon your hand. Jesus, and not you, has guided the movements of your instruments. At that time, Battle Creek Sanitarium had very few deaths from surgery, where it was average of 20 to 30% in most hospitals, where he had 1 out of 160. And you know, many times people come in when there is nothing you can do at that, and especially in those days. There was a picture of the sanitarium as it was in its heyday. It grew to where it became the wonder of the world. Rich of Europe would come to this place. The rich of America would come. It was a place of healing, a place of health education being taught. The breakfast cereal business started from there. He wanted to find ways to get better nutrition, and so he worked Now, the breakfast cereals of Kellogg's today, there's a lot of theirs prepared to come out he wouldn't be pleased with. Mostly sugar and white flour. But at that day, he was using the whole grains. And he was promoting the use of the peanuts as well. He also was promoting soybean products, and Dr. Miller was in school there at the American Medical College, who was known later as the China doctor that went to China for all his life. And over there, he then, working with the Chinese, was able to perfect and bring about a soy milk. The mothers not always were able to nurse the children. They didn't have another milk. They didn't have cows and so forth. And so the babies would die. And this way he was able to prepare a milk that sustained the babies. And then that was brought to the United States. Can you remember when soy milk tasted terrible? Boy, I wouldn't have anything to do with it in those days. Things are better now. Much better. I must now give to my brethren the instruction that the Lord has given me in regards to the health food question. By many people, the health foods are looked upon as man's devising, but they are of God's originating. As a blessing to his people, the health work is to be the property of God. It's not to be made a financial speculation for personal gain. That seemed to get lost sight of. The light that God has given and will continue to give on the food question is to be to his people today what the manna was to the children of Israel. The manna fell from heaven, and the people were told to gather it, prepare it to be eaten. So in different countries of the world, light has been given to the Lord's people, and health food suited to those countries, to these countries, will be prepared. Now, commercially today in our country, some of this has been adulterated. You know that. But still, there are many places. Do you realize that in Australia, they do about, maybe 7-8 years ago, I checked, they did $300 million a year of health food production of the cereal industry. They exported to 30 nations. And it belongs to the church there. Storm clouds of pantheistic teaching by Dr. Kellogg about the personality of God appeared. Slowly over time, as a 15-year period that he was beginning to agitate. But then the last 3-4 years that he was associated with the church, he began to promote certain concepts. It was the basis, in his concepts, is the basis of what tomorrow I'll be presenting and exposing. The same fundamental beliefs. And it had to do with the personality of God. The teaching was in Pantheism that God is not a personal being. It's a power. It's a force. Now, Kellogg didn't quite go that far. Mrs. White said he had something akin, close to pantheism. And today we call that panentheism. He said, yes, there is a living God, a being, but there's still part of his divinity that he has given to each person and to each plant. And so everything has divinity within it. And yet there's a living God. And so he began to teach this and agitate it. And it was so smooth that it was not recognized. Actually, in time, almost half of the General Conference and the physicians of Battle Creek had bought into this. In 1899, the General Conference was in session considering what to do. And what was this? They didn't understand it well. Mrs. White had been in Australia. And she envisioned, seeing what was happening, and she wrote a letter. And as they were meeting, this letter arrived, and it exposed, and they then could take a proper stand on it. In 1889, the General Conference session, Ellen White in Australia was given in vision warnings, which were sent to the General Conference meetings in the USA about the deceptive teachings of Dr. Kellogg. These were pantheistic concepts of the nature and personality of Christ. In the Eastern pantheism, everything was created, the cosmos, earth, and man created by a power. No living God. No God. And they call this power God. So everything is made of it and everything is God. That's why the Hindu has 330 million gods. Now, that which is akin to it is that, well, not everything's God, but God left some divinity in everything. It's really the same, but a little more sneaky. And that's what's sneaking through Protestantism today. The theory that was that God was in all substance. He was in the air, He was in the water, He was in the food. And righteousness came by faith, faith that God was in those things and that we received that righteousness by partaking of them. This was what was being taught. And it began to create a problem. Almost brought the church down. And here's a comment that he put in the General Conference Bulletin back in 1897. And this will help you see a little more of what I'm talking about. And look at this and think about it, because this is the foundation of tomorrow's message. We have here the evidence of a universal presence, an intelligent presence, an all-wise presence, an all-powerful presence. Now this presence, he's speaking about this power that I spoke about, this, some call it an energy. A presence by the aid of which every atom of the universe is kept in touch with every other atom. It's the foundation of astrology, this concept. This force that holds all things together, that is everywhere present, that thrills throughout the whole universe, that acts instantaneously through boundless space, can be nothing else than God Himself. What a wonderful thought, that this same God is in us and in everything. Not that His nature we partake of, but that He actually put divinity within us. This is what's teaching. And in these things that we'll expose tomorrow, most of them are involved in manipulating that divine energy. The illness is said to occur because it's out of balance. And these modalities, acupuncture, so forth, the whole goal is to manipulate and balance that energy, so-called. We'll get more there. All right, Testimonies 8. The theory that God is an essence. And Mrs. White called this what he called presence. She spoke of it as essence. This theory that God is an essence pervading all nature is one of Satan's most subtle devices. It misrepresents God and is a dishonor to His greatness and majesty. Do you realize how pervasive this belief is about us today in our society? Permeates it. The New Age movement's built upon that. Now they're called progressives. That's the core issue. Right there. 1902, we had fires in Battle Creek. Sanitarium burned, and then the Review and Herald Publishing burned. And in replacing this huge hospital, Dr. Kellogg wanted a 1,000-bed hospital and started immediately drawing plans for it. And God sent a message, says, no, have many small institutions. But he went ahead and did it anyhow. And he wrote a book called The Living Temple that he was going to sell to try to get money to build it. Plans were made to rebuild. Ellen White advised to build small. Dr. Kellogg wanted to build large, 1,000 beds, and he did build a 1,000-bed hospital. He proposed to write a book on health to sell and to raise money to pay for it. The book, The Living Temple. And the printing press wouldn't print it because it had these pantheistic concepts throughout it. And he got it published elsewhere and then began to sell it. And this book's theme was akin to the pantheistic concepts. That comment that he just made about the presence, that was what was permeating through the book. And the church, of course, it mentioned, did not publish, and he had it published elsewhere. And this began an open sort of rebellion in the church, a group against others in the leadership, which really came to a head some time later. And here's some comments made about what she spoke of mysticism within this book, this pantheistic concept, panentheistic. We need not the mysticism that is in this book, The Living Temple. Those who entertain these sophistries will soon find themselves in a position where the enemy can talk with them and lead them away from God. Just accepting his concepts and reading the book and staying with it a bit, she says the devil can talk to him direct. I just finished rereading a book called Deceived by the New Age by Will Barron. How many have heard or read that book in the past? Here's one person, a couple over here. Will Barron has worked with me to help me in my work, so to make sure I didn't make mistakes. And I've corresponded with him a lot on there. And he, in his book, the devil talked directly to him regularly. And he got involved. He was an Adventist to begin with. And he got involved through psychology and so forth, and got in, and then he became a priest in the New Age for 12 years. Deep into it on there. And this, the enemy talked to him directly. In the book, The Living Temple, there is present the alpha of deadly heresies. The omega will follow and will be received by those who are not willing to heed the warning God has given. Let me read it again. In the book, The Living Temple, is presented the alpha of deadly heresies. The omega, the end, will follow, will be received by those who are not willing to heed the warning God has given. Be not deceived. Many will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. We have now before us the alpha of this danger. The omega will be a most startling nature. And I think what we're speaking about tomorrow at least is a part of it. I don't want to think it's the whole omega, but I think it fits in as a part of that because it is so deceptive and has come in with such rapidity throughout the church. Battle Creek Sanitarium was rebuilt, 1,000-bed, and then eventually the college there at Battle Creek moved to Bering Springs, at Andrews University today. General Conference moved to Washington, D.C. This nucleus of Adventists in Battle Creek spread apart and began to move out of there. But Dr. Kellogg kept teaching the Pantheism, and the division eventually occurred between clergy and the medical leaders. Final separation in 1906. The medical institution was not in the name of the church, so it was lost by the church. Blessings were withdrawn. The last medical students graduated in 1910. Now I'm going to go fast because I see I've spent a lot of time on here. In 1901, Ellen White was shown of God that medical institutions were to be developed in California. And the conference is only 1,100 people. In 1904, they bought 2 institutions that had gone broke that were sort of spas or special places built. And they went broke, so they got them cheap. Paradise Valley, which is down San Diego, and Glendale Sanitarium, which is next to Los Angeles. Nice, beautiful buildings. Here we see the top one was the one that was down at San Diego, Paradise Valley, and then Glendale. That's the building that originally was there. And they started their sanitariums right off, all built and everything. But she says, get another one. The conference says, what do you mean? You've told us to stay out of debt. And now we're in debt with 2, and you're telling us to get a third one. And so Dr. Burden, that was out of Loma Linda areas, found Loma Linda a big one of these buildings, more like the one at the bottom there. It was on top of a hill out there in the valley. And he told her about that, and she says, go look at it. And but he had no money. She says, borrow it. He borrowed $1,000, put it down, got it for $40,000. There's a whole story there that is just magnificent in how that money came in. Will not take time. But that still wasn't the ones. There was still to be another one down there. And this, of course, made the leaders pull their hair out. They'd had all they can deal. So aside from the church leadership, this getting of Loma Linda moved forward without necessarily burdening them. They had a burden. In 1901, she saw in vision this special institution. And then it was to be an educational institution and would rise at this special place. And in 1905, Loma Linda was purchased. In June that year, she visited and said it was the one she had seen in vision. And that's what it looked like at that time from one view. And the other view is how it looked on the top of the hill as you're down below the hill. I had my meals in this house, this building, for 2 years, my first 2 years of medical school. We were still using the cafeteria in 1960 and 61, 62. Then eventually the other buildings were built. But it was quite a beautiful place originally. And there was the first nursing group, the first baby born. Ellen White addressing in 1906, giving a dedicatory address at Loma Linda. Students of doing hydrotherapy. And then they were out for doing missionary work at the microscope. God was in control. November 5, 1905, nursing school opened. 1909, the medical school opened, College of Medical Evangelists. My diploma says College of Medical Evangelists. Training to be of the highest order. Students to have the privilege of maintaining a living connection with the wisest of all physicians, from whom there is communicated a knowledge of superior order. To the world, the graduates went out from American Medical College, and they went out from Loma Linda to around the world and across the United States, establishing institutions many places, sometimes simply clinics. And then nursing schools began. I counted once that we had 55 nursing schools at one time. Schools, of course, you know, Loma Linda now is a great institution, and what it's changed there, we have, I think, 6 medical schools around the country now and several dental schools. 1967, the School of Public Health, which I was graduated from in 1978 also. And Loma Linda University became the name there. This shows the Good Samaritan as helping the injured traveler. The institution, of course. And I would just show you, I worked as a mission hospital in this little place in Phuket, Thailand. This was on an island, Paradise. And this was our hospital. And had 50 beds. It was filled all of the time. And downtown, 3 miles away, we had a big clinic. And I'm dealing with somebody with has something wrong with her foot in this clinic. And in the waiting room, there is a deep well. And you throw a bucket down, bring the water up. And the kids that are sick in a fever, they stand them there and they bring the water up and douse them as they're waiting to see the doctor. And when you get in your examining room, they'll bring in maybe 10 patients all at once and sit them down, and you see one at a time. Everybody listens to everybody else's problem till you finally finish out, and then you get a new group in. That's how we did there. I'll just give you a little surgery. I was the surgeon for the hospital while I was there. And my son was 12 years old. I had him come to take the pictures. And as I was doing the spinal anesthetic, getting ready to do the surgery, he fainted with my camera. But I saved the camera. And then he got up and he took the rest of the pictures. But a little shaky here, so it's not clear like the other picture was. We're getting the baby out, coming out of the uterus. And there it is, sucking out the throat. And this individual had to have her leg taken off, had gangrene of the foot. And this is a common problem in the East. The next day. And on the way home, I visited a friend of mine, a doctor in Penang, in Malaysia. He was sick himself in the hospital at the time. And just showing this hospital was given to the church to run down at Orlando. It's by Disney World, built by them, and the church was given the hospital to operate. Health foods, breakfast cereals, peanut butter, meat substitutes, soy milk for infants, soy milk, and so forth. These have a part. Some of them have been adulterated a bit, but God was behind it. The world influence. Hospital administration organization was invited to China some years ago to teach Chinese doctors how to, or their administrators how to run hospitals. I know, took a trip to China with the man that actually was Adventist man that invited our hospital people to go over there, and he worked with the government, and they gave them courses on how to operate hospitals. Then the heart team, children's heart transplant center, preventive medicine to the world, and today we have standing out in the world due to the Adventist Health Study. We'll get to that in a moment. But the heart transplant party, these children had all had a new heart by the doctors there, and they came for a birthday, and that was quite a few years ago. So how many now? I don't know. There was a huge hospital built in China, the Sir Run Run Shaw Hospital, which I had the privilege of visiting on time, but it was built by a rich man in Hong Kong for his hometown of China, And then he asked the Loma Linda personnel to go operate it and teach the doctors there their way of operating a hospital. The world influence of the church from those simple visions that God gave to Ellen White. We had Dr. Wayne McFarland, Pastor Elman Falkenberg, that started the Stop Smoking program some years ago. Vegetarianism shown to be scientifically sound and superior. Dr. Harding, you remember Fred Harding that was in this conference for a long time, his son. And then Dr. Register. They pioneered and set forth, opened up through the science people the acceptance of the health. And there's Dr. McFarland, he was one of my teachers, and Dr. Harding also. Actually, Dr. Harding, you may not know this, you've heard a lot about cholesterol through the years. He was the first one to point out to the medical world the relationship of cholesterol and heart disease, vessel disease. That was the first health study done. He was getting his doctoral degree at Harvard University in nutrition. So he studied Adventist versus non-Adventist as to whether their health was equal. It was, but in this study he tested animal fats and delineated between animal fats and vegetable fats, plant fats. First time it had ever been done. And he did cholesterols with them. And the cholesterols weren't used to being done except for another reason. And lo and behold, here it showed that those consuming the amounts of the animal fats had higher cholesterol levels. And the world was in an epidemic of heart disease, sudden death, all across the country at this point. In 1900, unknown practically. By 1950, it was America's leading cause of death, dying like flies. And so the doctors didn't have a clue what's doing this. And this gave the medical science a clue, and then started this great study of cholesterol and its relationship to animal fats. So that was the first Adventist health study, but not named at that. It was his doctoral degree study, his thesis. But that was the first one, and he tells this story himself. That's where I got it. And Dr. Register, he was a marvelous man that was head of the School of Dietitians. And I want to close with, a year ago I attended in February, the International Congress of Vegetarianism. We had over 800 people from 36 nations, scientists. And what has brought the interest that brings all these people from around the world? The Adventist Health Study, 1 and number 2. Most of you probably are involved in those. And when it's being shown now how valuable this is, and it's being accepted in Western Europe, especially in the science community, and the young people in our church, more and more people are ignoring it and putting it aside, unfortunately, when it's being shown to be the most valuable way. And this was really a privilege to attend, and there we're at the convention. I sat by a young lady that was from London, and she had her doctoral degree in whole foods. That's a new expression, plant-based diet instead of vegetarianism, a comment that's not so irritating to people. And plant-based foods seems to fit. And she had her doctoral degree. I didn't know they had some. She got it in London, in England, and then there was in Germany, 3 institutions, universities that opened up a BS degree in whole foods. Interesting what's happening on there. So this Congress held every 5 years. We are at session number 7, and it's sharing with the world the end results. Now, in degenerative diseases, the basic causes of these diseases of our day used to be infections, but that's been cleared up mostly. But it's smoking and diet, low exercise, and being overweight are the main sources of our problems today. And what is the answer? What we've been reading for years and years is what was the conclusion at the end of this Congress. The diet of grains, fruits, nuts, and vegetables constitute the diet chosen for us by our Creator. Fruits, grains, and vegetables prepared in a simple way, free from spice and grease of all kind. Make with the milk or cream the most healthful diet. Now, in closing, I show a graph. Now, I used to show this. I went for many years in Russia. Started in about 1999 going to Russia, and sharing with churches over there in public evangelism. From the far left, you'll see there, the dark green bar is how long the average Russian male lived, 58 years. His working days ended at about 52 years of age as an average. And then over here, the SDA and the vegetarian SDA, if you cut their life in half and give that extra half to them, that's how much more following this lifestyle would give them in life. And so as I spoke to the young ministers, they'd bring in all the ministers of a conference for me to stay with for several days teaching. I'd say, you can be the same as this over here if you just listen the next 3 days and willing to follow it. That can be your end results. To God be the glory. Tomorrow I invite you back. We're going to be dealing tomorrow morning first with 2 great deceptions. We want to look at the Bible says about these deceptions. And then I'm going to present in the 11 o'clock hour the key that unlocked the confusion that I had for 20 years. And I think you'll find it. I took that to Russia the first time I went, in 1999. I was facing doctors and nurses and pharmacists and dentists and preachers that had grown up believing it. This stuff that I was exposing had been taught to them in medical schools. It was motherhood. And so here a person that doesn't speak their language, general practitioner, out in a little country town with no credentials of a university or anything, coming to tell them what they were involved in was not of God. I knew it wouldn't go over very good. I really didn't, sort of hesitated going. But God blessed. And what broke the ice is that key that I present tomorrow morning as they saw the depth of what the practices they were following came out of, to understand its basis. So please come tomorrow. We'll share with you what I've learned. Would you stand with me and we'll have prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are grateful. We know that you have been here through your Holy Spirit tonight, that you have touched our hearts to want to be faithful to that which you have directed us, to accept you as our God, to accept your leading and not quibble about it. May that be our experience, and may we have life eternal through the faith in the shed blood of Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all.